All right, I am Josh Deere, and I am here with my good friend James Sire, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the past few years as a writer, as an editor, as a brother in the Lord. And I just thought I'd take a few minutes to ask him some questions about his own writing history and your own experience as an editor. So to begin with, for anyone watching who may not be very familiar with your books, why don't we start by talking about your books and your own writing and the writing that you've done in the past. You want to kind of give an overview of some of the signature books that you've done, and especially The Universe Next Door, since it's kind of the best known work, and the different printings that it went through. You want to talk about those for a few minutes?
Okay.
Sure.
Well, the first book I wrote actually was just a simple textbook for college students writing papers on literature. I did it with a co-author who had been published before, but the book did not succeed in its aim of being a college text. Sold a few, but that was about it. And so I didn't think I was going to do any more writing on it. Well, I've had my chance. The publisher was a big publisher, a New York publisher, but it didn't do well. So I had been asked to be an editor, and I thought because I was getting a book published, I probably could do that, and I was right. What I didn't know at the time is I wasn't going to be successful with my first book. So it's probably just as well I didn't know what was going to happen to that. But it wasn't long after I began to edit Francis Schaeffer and other people that I got to be very interested in a certain set of ideas that I developed from graduate school as a Christian. And I gave some lectures at a camp. I gave more lectures on the same subject the year afterwards. And in 2 or 3 years, they said, "Why don't you write this up as a book?" Which was not my intention, because I said, well, I speak, I've done that, I've taught, I've done that, but really, a book? But I did it, and it turned out to be a book that was accepted immediately as a college textbook. I'd written The Universe Next Door as a guide to young students, freshmen, sophomores, junior, seniors, if so, who were puzzled by the ideologies, life views, and so forth that they ran into at the university. And so all I did in the book really was to try to describe each of those as clearly as I could, and then see each of them, critique each of them, view each of them from the perspective of the Christian worldview. So that's what the book is. It's a set of worldviews that focus on how students, especially in the university, encounter the ideas that oftentimes are quite troubling to them.
And it's been translated and used all over the world for...
It has, especially when the walls came down in Europe. It had already been translated in a few languages, but when the walls came down in Eastern Europe, it was selected among 10 others that would be recommended to these countries as books that might be helpful to them. So it got published in Poland and Czech Republic and Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, it became a textbook at a Catholic theological seminary. Romania, various Eastern worldviews. Russian, actually, as well. And already it had been in Chinese. Very interesting. The one place it didn't do well is it's interesting itself about what culture is like. It never did it was never really translated into Spanish. And I learned fairly soon, I had a suspicion of why. Spain has a different intellectual history than the U.S. So Christians in the U.S. are dealing with the Enlightenment, they're dealing with the Reformation, and Christians in South America are either Catholics and are not dealing with a shift in their Christianity, or they're Protestants, especially charismatics. And if you look at their past and their present, if they're thinking of something other than the traditional Catholic view of South America, they're not going to get much help from the universe next door, because it's going to take them to the Enlightenment and to the kinds of intellectual forces that were developed in the Western world. So it's basically a book for Western Christians, Europe, U.S., Canada, Australia, places like that.
Great. All right. And what are some of the other books that have been especially popular? I know,
Well, one of the first books I did afterwards was a book called How to Read Slowly.
Yeah.
And How to Read Slowly was a book out of my own primary background as an English teacher on literature. I taught literature. That was my profession. And this book was how to read slowly. I was teaching at a university where the chairman of the department had a course in speed reading,
Mm-hmm.
and I was the victim of his students at the end of his course, and I found that they could speed read just fine, but they couldn't read carefully.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I wrote the book as a countermeasure to the department chairman.
Sure.
And I'm quite sure that even that book did better than his
Mm-hmm.
reading course. But in any case, that was one of the first. The second one was to look at the Christian worldview in more detail, especially the intellectual aspects of the Christian worldview. That was called Discipleship of the Mind. So The Universe Next Door, The Discipleship of the Mind, and How to Read Slowly were the first books. I've done about 20 books,
Mm-hmm.
if you count books and not smaller publications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you've written on a broad range of subjects. I mean, from everything from learning more about Jesus through the Psalms to a biography, a book about Václav Havel that is for a more particular audience.
Yes, we haven't found what that audience is yet.
But they're all wonderful for various reasons. Is there another book? I know you're pleased that The Universe Next Door has been so helpful to people. Is there another book that you think maybe would be just as helpful to people if they would take the time to read it and pass it around more? Is there which of these books are you more proud of or more excited about that you would like to see circulated?
Well, one book that has been successful, you look at The Universe Next Door is going to tell you more about my thinking than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
The second book, to get into how I try to approach things as a thinking person, is Habits of the Mind.
Mm-hmm.
That was 30 years later. And Habits of the Mind is really about what it means to be a Christian intellectual. It begins with a story about how when I was dating my wife, we were out in front of the Nebraska State Historical Society one noon, and I said to my wife, you know, I'd like to be an intellectual. I reminded her of this as I was putting the book together, and she said, you know, you always were a snob. and that became the introduction to Habits of the Mind. In that book, what I looked at was the ways in which I think we as Christians ought to use our mind. So it wasn't just about logic.
Mm-hmm.
It was about the virtues of the intellect, or intellectual virtues, like humility and curiosity and interest in detail and long term, and also things that would help you to be a better reader and a better thinker.
Okay. Now, you're possibly best known for your work as an editor at InterVarsity Press, where you spent years there serving, and one of the things that grabs my attention most when I hear you talk about that is the work you did with Francis Schaeffer. So why don't we, to make sure that we have time to cover it, let you talk for a few minutes about your work with Francis Schaeffer and your work at InterVarsity.
Well, when I came to InterVarsity Press in 1968, there were two British publications that the press was issuing as American publications. One of them was The God Who Is There, the other was Escape from Reason. God Who Is There and Escape from Reason were published 6 or 8 months apart in England, but there was a strike on the St. Lawrence Seaway, so our copies of Escape from Reason came out at the same time as our copies of The God Who Is There. I remember sitting, or actually kneeling, in the basement of the house that we had IVP in at the time, and proofing the back cover copy, and discovering that the name of Jean-Paul Sartre was misspelled. So we threw away 10,000 back cover and had to reprint those at a time when InterVarsity Press was running on a shoestring.
Yeah.
But we did it right. The director of the press, Jim Nyquist, said, oh, we can't have Sartre's name misspelled. Yeah. So we got it spelled correctly and produced the book. And they were very successful. Wasn't long after that, Francis Schaeffer was at Wheaton. He gave the he gave the talks that became, in our publication, Death in the City. And I saw that book from solicitation by Jim to publication, to my primary editorial work as a successful publication. That was just the first of, I think we did about 13 of his books, but by the time before he wrote Why Should Anyone Believe, no, what is it? I wrote Why Should Anyone Believe Anything at All. That's my book.
Getting your works and his works mixed up.
Getting my work mixed up. No, it's a book on and a movie that came out afterwards.
How Then Should We
How
Live?
Then Should We
yeah,
Live?
yeah, yeah.
Exactly. How Then Should We Live?
Right.
I did the editorial work on that book, but
Good.
we didn't publish it.
Okay. But now, I remember talking to you once before about how people tend to be either very gifted as writers or very gifted as speakers, and Schaeffer was definitely more gifted as a communicator orally than he was.
Very much so. He told me one day that he called from his lectures at Princeton, the Princeton Chapel, and he was so excited because he said his voice rang through that chapel. He said, I missed my calling as a medieval priest, because the Gothic chapel really, well, Francis Schaeffer didn't know how raspy and high-pitched and unrhetorically sound his voice was.
Yeah.
But it sounded good to him.
Yeah.
The other thing that he was unable to do, and he told me, I finally learned why I have so much difficulty pronouncing names. And of course he was terrible when it came to pronouncing Italian names, or even French names. Albert Camus was Camus, things like that. And he said, you know, Jim, I discovered that I have dyslexic. If you didn't get it, dyslexia.
Yeah.
Which he ecclesiastically pronounced as dyslexic.
That's pretty funny.
And he did. But he was an excellent speaker. He captivated audiences. He turned people on. He responded to the real questions of real people. He used to say, I'm not an apologist. I give answers to real questions, good answers to real questions, whatever the question is. So he was tuned in to the kind of mindset that the students came to him from the U.S., Christians and those who weren't Christians, who ended up at L'Abri, and he could answer and directly answer their questions in a way that they could understand. So yeah, I took his manuscripts. They weren't manuscripts. That's a misnomer. I took the transcriptions that were made, for example, at Wheaton College and elsewhere, and turned them into publishable, printable material. That first work was actually done in England for the first two books by people who later on came to Found Lion Press, for instance. So Francis has always needed help to get his work into published form.
But what a blessing that y'all did that, because now they're so influential. And
Absolutely. Yeah, I was baffled. I was teaching an English course over at Northern Illinois University, secular university, not far from here. And this was the day that the Kent State Massacre occurred, and I couldn't teach my class. Students at our university were rioting as well. And so when my class came up in the evening, I turned it into a discussion session. I asked them, first of all, questions. What's happening? What's going on? It's an hour and a quarter class, and after about a half an hour, a little bit more, they ran out of questions. And I said, well, let me tell you what I think is going on. And I took a Schaefferian analysis using primarily Schaeffer's language for what was happening. And after the class, students were very, very happy that I'd done that. Of course, to get away from learning about Schaeffer, about Shakespeare and Milton, that probably was a joy to them alone. But they were so happy that they had had somebody who would listen to them and pay attention to them. And one of the students said, "Did you ever heard of the man called Francis Schaeffer?" Because I had not mentioned his name. You ever hear of the man called Francis Schaeffer? And I said, how did you ever learn about him? Well, this was a kid in a student group, Methodist student group. And I scratched my head and I said, Methodist student group. I didn't tell him that. But he had an influence beyond his basically Presbyterian leanings. He had Anglicans and Presbyterians first and foremost, and anyone who was in the Reformed tradition, very influential there. But he moved outside that and did lectures for the Lutherans, especially the Missouri Synod Lutherans, more conservative groups, and was from about 1968 through about 1976, 77, after the publication of How Should We Then Live, which broadened his impact much more. He was very influential, and some people say, well, Schaeffer made you as a publisher, IVP as a publisher. It was very much symbiotic. We had the market in IVP that Francis Schaeffer's books were for. We were published for university students, and we had a reputation as a credible voice in the intellectual world. Primarily, let it be said, primarily from our English roots. John Stott, one of our major authors. So it was a time that was very good for publishing. And then the evangelical world itself had become, it was burgeoning. By 1976, I began editing in 1968. By 1976, Time magazine came out, the year of the intellectuals. And yes, it was. And it had been for a few years, and it continued for a few years. And then it slacked off. And the kinds of books that were, we published them, they'd sell, were published in the 80s, for the 80s, and we published them and they dribbled out. Most of them were somewhat successful, but nothing like the era of, we'll say, 1974 through 1977, 78, 79.
Very fascinating. What can you say about how you would determine, when you were working for university, how did you discern which books you wanted to publish? I know sometimes you publish books that you didn't personally necessarily agree with theologically, but I mean, how did you recognize that it was a book that needed to be published and was worth pursuing? And
that's a very good question, because some editors, some publishers have a narrow scope of what they're interested in publishing, and they won't go outside of it. One publisher lost a number of editors in their process because the editor wanted to be a little bit broader than the publishing house. So to be an editor for a Christian publishing house is a risky business. How long are you going to be around? Well, I was around totally for 30 years. First 16, I was director of the editorial department. What was the key from my own perspective? Well, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship is a broad range publisher, or I should say university movement, that spans the gap from Episcopal to charismatic, be more one or the other, more reformed or less reformed, or more holiness or less holiness, depending on the church, the school or the area. In the South, of course, it's heavily Baptist, but in Michigan, it's heavily Reformed. And so I was quite pleased to be that kind of ecumenical Christian. Not the ecumenical Christian of the typical ecumenical group, which is broadly speaking almost anyone who wants to call themselves Christians are a Christian. Though this was we had 10 propositions that we hoped that wished that our members and our people would teach, and would be teaching that framework. And I was right there through the whole time. And that allowed me to use that as the theological foundation. The other foundation was it well written? And as an English teacher, I should know what something well written is like. And is it intelligent? Which is something, again, that a professor of English, or any professor, can be. And when I was hired, I was also not so specific in my education. British publisher, InterVarsity Press. The director for that press used to say to Jim Nyquist, once said to Jim Nyquist,
Okay, what do you think about your work with John Stott? How closely did you work with him? He's one of my favorite Bible teachers of the...
Well, I was working closely with John Stott, and I was working closely with Francis Schaeffer.
Yeah.
Francis Schaeffer would say to me, you know, John Stott, next time you see him, because I usually went to Europe and I'd see both of them, next time you see John Stott, will you tell him for me? And then John would give me his stricter notion of what ought to constitute the kinds of church that Christians ought to go into.
Mm-hmm.
Tell John Stott for me that he should be more like the, I can't remember the guy's name, out in the suburbs. And so I'd go and I'd see John Stott, and I'd say, you know, Francis Schaeffer has a word for you. And John would say, well, you tell Francis Schaeffer.
Yeah. So you're going back and forth between them.
Going back and forth. It's just a happenstance courier.
Yeah.
Essentially, what they really wanted me to do is stop doing that.
Yeah.
They do their own dialogues, and they did their own dialogues. They were friends, but they disagreed on whether John ought to continue in the Anglican Church.
Mm.
You should. It's too apostate, and Schaeffer thought that ought to be more strict.
Mm-hmm.
But John stayed in the Anglican Church, and it was an incredible blessing
Mm-hmm.
to the Anglicans. Interestingly enough, there aren't very many Episcopalians who know John Stott. There are a few, and there's a school outside Pittsburgh that is a school that is heavily indebted to John Stott type Episcopal or Anglican Christianity. But anyway, in the United States there are a lot of Episcopal students who found John Stott very helpful. But they found that in the university groups or in other groups that had found John Stott's work helpful.
Yeah. Well, okay. Can you talk some about your personal approach to writing? Did you typically know that you wanted to write a book, or was it just that you had papers put that you wanted to that you had written for various purposes, and then you determined they needed to be published together as a book? How did you handle your writing, and what?
That's a good question. First of all, as I said, I did not expect to be a book writer.
Mm-hmm.
My first book, by the way, the first book that was an academic book or a student book, a textbook, it didn't sell. So, hey, this is not my job. Mm-hmm. But my edited books, they sold. But then when I did the first book, encouraged by the people who had sponsored my lectures and encouraged by fellow friend Steve Board, who later on had his own publishing house and who published some of my material. I did that. Steve he was the editor of his magazine, and he let me read every chapter to him before we put it to bed.
Mm-hmm.
And lo and behold, it was successful. So the success of that got me lots of lectures on university campuses, both secular and Christian. And so I began to accumulate other things that I thought, like how to read slowly, combining my academic Christian work, my academic literature work, mm-hmm. with my editorial work and my academic theological work. So that came from that combination. But I never wrote a book that I hadn't thought about a long time before it actually got written. I never started from scratch and said, well, let's see, I don't know where I'm going, I'm going to start. I by that time become a guest teacher at a number of universities and a guest lecturer at university groups across the country, and when the walls came down in Europe, across Eastern Europe. So I had always had a background for what I had written or what I was to write,
mm-hmm.
and the people I've talked to and listened to. So I had a lot of feedback along the way, and a pretty good idea of what might be useful, might be helpful. I wrote from that. As I say, I never did sit down and say, gee, I'd like to write a book on X, Y, Z. And when I was an editor, I used that same principle. Somebody would say, gee, I'd really like to write a book for InterVarsity Press. What should I write? And I would say something like, I can't think of a thing. If I'm going to have to ask them, mm-hmm. they don't know enough to be a writer, because writing a book is a substantive process. Mm-hmm. There has to be substance to what you're writing. I'd like to write a book about chickens.
Mm-hmm.
You know anything about chickens? No, but if I were writing a book, I could find out. No.
Yeah.
No. A chicken farmer can write a book about chickens.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But the local editor who's never lived on a chicken farm, as good as he could write, had better not try to write a book about chickens.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, journalists are the sort of people who can walk in and, yeah, they could cover a story on chickens, and they'll learn enough as they go. But it's all journalism.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. Their stories are from other people. They're not profound insights. They just happen to be chance quotations or chance ideas that seem to be good at the time, and you get an article on them, and you put it to bed, and you're done.
They're not typically contributing anything new to the conversation.
Very rarely
Yeah.
do journalists do that. Now, some do. Oh, man, I've got a great appreciation for David Brooks.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful writer. Very, very close to being a Christian. Amazingly close. He writes at Time, New York. Do you know David Brooks?
I don't.
New York Times?
I don't.
The Brooks, Shields and Brooks report on ABC News. No, PBS News, NewsHour on Fridays. Some of his best friends, by the way, are evangelicals. Now, you wouldn't know that. He's Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
but contemporary Jewish. He's not Jewish by a given faith, but in perspective, he's got a kind of biblical Old Testament Jewish perspective with an open mind and a willingness to listen to others. His book, for instance, Road to Character, is marvelous, and one of the people on the road to character that he uses as an illustration is Augustine, Dorothy Day. Not all of them in there are Christians, but everything in that would be, I mean, if a Christian read that book, there was nothing in that book on character that would not be appropriate for a Christian. It's absolutely amazing. So I'm not against journalists when they're like David Brooks, but they have to be sharp as a tack.
Yeah.
And they got to know what they're talking about.
Yeah. Well, while I'm doing this recording, why don't you kind of tell the Belhaven story again? That's pretty classic. That's pretty classic. That's,
okay, we'll try to make it as
and that has a deep connection with my past, my history.
Yeah, Josh went to Belhaven and
yeah.
graduated. But years after I was there. I was there in, 79 or 80, somewhere along in there. And the Belhaven was, as I understand it, it's my perspective, don't believe everything I'm saying, but this is what I understand. The school was on difficult financial situations, and it needed to work its way out. It was a typical, what I would call, a typical liberal arts college with a Southern Baptist background, but with not really much attention to
With a Southern Baptist background?
Yes. Oh, no, I'm sorry, Presbyterian.
Right,
I'm wrong,
right,
Presbyterian background.
Mm.
Presbyterian background, so that the theology was there, the same theology that pretty much that I had by that time. But they weren't dealing with a biblical understanding of literature or of sociology or of art, which was pretty obvious after I was there and conversed with it. But I didn't know that. I just knew and suspected, and I knew that the leaders, the president, had been hired in order to turn the school, in my language, more into a Wheaton type school, where liberal arts and the gospel were
Intertwined.
Welded together. They weren't then, and so I was told by the president the evening before before the graduation. I was the graduation speaker. The evening before, he said, "Here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make the school more explicitly Christian, like King College in Bristol, Tennessee, which had gone through it before successfully, and we need to get a new perspective for what we think about Christian education." So
All right, if you will, please continue the Belhaven story.
Well, the president wanted me to help them begin to change their university into a more completely Christian university, something like the Wheaton College, where there's an integration between the academic disciplines and the Christian faith. I said he couldn't do it because the university was under the control of the faculty. Well, the next day was the graduation, and then I was the speaker for the graduation, and the next day was the faculty conference, and I gave a talk on some of the characteristics of a university that was also Christian, but at the same time academic, and dealt carefully with the academic level of Christian faith in relationship to the arts and the sciences and so forth. I thought there was no response to that evening. I gave that, no response. So I went home, went to bed, it was fine. Next day I gave my next talk to only the liberal arts faculty. And before I gave my second talk, I said, are there any questions about the first talk? Well, I never got to the second talk because they all objected to the notion that they needed to change anything at Belhaven in order to be Christian in their approach to the arts and the sciences and the fine arts and so forth. The artist there, I think I was the head, somebody in the art department objected violently, the dean objected. And I said, well, I have a plane to catch in a half an hour. So I left feeling very unsuccessful. 2 years later, they invited me back, and it was just all smiles, including the dean. There was one woman, the nice southern lady, she just was on her knees practically. Oh, I'm so sorry the way we treated you when you were here before. What I told the president was wrong. They were able to do it. They got the job done. And so I had to eat my words on that.
In a good way.
In a very good way. Delighted to eat my words. So when Josh went there, the university was in the shape that I put it in.
That's right.
Yes,
that's right. It had a Christian worldview as the required core curriculum for the whole program, for the whole school. It was great.
I take pride in that,
Yeah. The Lord used you. You did have a role in that.
I would hope so, but I'm a little more modest than that.
That's great.
Well, surprise.
And I'm very thankful for that, for sure.
It's the same kind of surprise I had when I found that this book that I didn't ever want to write, turned out to have an impact and encouraged me to do other books, including a most recent, which I'm most
Share a bit about that.
Yeah, the most recent one is Apologetics Beyond Reason, and it is my swan song, and I think it's been basically unheard. So buy that book and hear my swan song, and I'll die quietly and silently and be lowered into my grave, waiting the resurrection.
Oh goodness!
That's right.
What's the particular contribution you feel that it makes? What is it? What's the?
Oh, it's just the last thing I want to say. And one of the things that it does is that it puts the whole intellectual, reasonable approach to the Christian faith in a place lower than I had given it before. Now you would say, well, this is my whole world devoted to an academic understanding of the relationship between reality and the Christian faith and academic disciplines. Yes, it is. But it privileges a way of understanding God that doesn't give enough of a nod, if needs more than a nod, enough of a recognition that God participates with us directly, not through reasoning, but through a direct experience of His presence. Some people would say, as one of my friends does, Sire has become a mystic. No, I just recognize that there's more than one way to get at the knowledge of God, and that it actually is more convincing. Because that's at the point where you've taken your ideas, and suddenly these ideas are not just things that you check off when you're doing something. They're ideas that permeate your whole being, because you have participated in the way in which these arguments really finally work. If they work, they work by convincing. But argument is always open to doubt. But conviction has to be shattered by something that really penetrates it. Well, what really penetrates our convictions is the Spirit of God. It's what moves us from unfaith to faith. So I would give a lot more credence to thinking about the role that our experience has. What happens to us on our knees? What happens to us when we're listening to a sermon? What happens to us when we're reading Scripture? not particularly thinking about it as a scholar, but thinking about it as a reader. Implicitly saying, what's God saying to me as I read these words? I use, not recently very much, but for a while I was using Lectio Divina, in which you concentrate on the words that pop out to you in a scriptural passage, and you let those words settle in. How come those words popped out? Is there something that God wants me to know about this thing which suddenly surprised me?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure almost everyone has this experience, that I read this passage many times before, but I didn't ever see.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't, but now you do. Or you did and you forgot,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to be reminded. Here is something that, and it can make you feel very guilty, or it can make you feel very elated.
Mm-hmm.
Depends on which it is.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness, I just said that to my boss. Oh, I just said that to my wife. I just said that to I should not have done that, you know. I get a lot of those.
Yeah. All right, well, as the final question, for all of my writer friends, I've got a lot of friends who write Christian books and desire to see them get into print by publishers such as InterVarsity. What counsel, what advice would you give to aspiring writers or to